the topic today is China, which of course is insane to try to talk about China in 30 minutes. But before I do so, I want to let you know that when the video goes on, underneath the description, it will say you can click on Show Me, and there will be an article that you can click on by Robert Kagan, which is called Our Constitutional Crisis is Already Here. Robert Kagan, for those of you not familiar with him, is a neocon conservative person with whom I have not agreed on almost anything over decades. However, this particular article is very important, I think, and very insightful to tell us where we are in the world, where we are domestically mainly, excuse me. And I think it's worth reading because people overseas will also read it and will get a sense of our disarray in this country and our sort of danger of becoming an authoritarian government down the line if, for example, Trump gets reelected and we have more violence. So I think it's a really important article, and I would urge you all to read it because I think it'll help us see how other people will see us and, of course, how we should see ourselves. So China, I mean, it is foolhardy to try to talk about China in 30 minutes, but I think that there so many things going on about China, both in terms of US domestic policy as well as events in China itself, that I at least want to sketch out some of the things that we should be looking at and perhaps worrying about. The first thing I want to say is that you might have seen a Friedman article, the title in the New York Times, the title of which was China Leaders Are Having Fun with Us. That is one take. And the other take comes from Antonio Guterres at the opening of the UN General Annual Assembly, where he pleaded both of the United States and China not to start a Cold War. So even looking beyond the specifics, things are going on that are worth looking at now, trying to understand now as they are evolving. One of the disappointing aspects, to me at least, about the Biden administration is that our China policy, on the one hand, seems to be a continuation of China bashing, et cetera, from the Trump administration. And on the other hand, taking fairly radical, or at least radical from the Chinese perspective, actions in their part of the world. So I'll talk about those later on. But before I deal with the sort of international dimensions, let us look at the sort of domestic dimensions in China. So as you probably realize that Secretary General Xi is having difficulties at home of one kind or another. Most countries have domestic difficulties, but China's at the moment are quite serious. One, he is trying to change the direction of the Chinese economy, which for the last years has been, major corporations, world-class corporations with international footprints, making, gazillions of dollars, and running themselves like any capitalist corporations would do. Parallel to that, there have still been government corporations and businesses, but which the government could control and has been controlling all along. But the capitalism of the Chinese economy, which has helped it flourish and helped it become a really important economic actor in the world, was left essentially unattended by the government. And the Chinese government has recently, last few weeks, changed directions on that. It really is cracking down on the tech sector. It is cracking down on many major corporations. It is essentially saying to the capitalistic private businesses that they must now report in many ways to the government, and that the government will kind of supervise and rein them in. You might have noticed that the heads of some major Chinese companies, Mr. Ma, the head of Didi, the ride-sharing companies, and so forth, which used to traipse around globally, would come to the US, would give interviews and so forth, all of a sudden are missing in action. That is to say, the heads of these major Chinese companies, the names of all we all know, which produce the products we all buy, the technology, the internet, various versions of it, and so forth, have all become very quiet and have sort of are hiding under the shells of the companies. Now, one of the reasons for this is, of course, that the Chinese government, Xi, has essentially said that the capitalism in China has led to huge inequalities. You have billionaires and gazillionaires, just like you do in the United States. And the benefits of the incredible economic profits of these companies have not been shared equitably with the rest of the population. This, as you realize, is of course also the case in the United States, right? Where we're talking about the major corporations are hardly paying any taxes and so forth. So in that sense, he is sort of reintroducing socialism into the economy of China and saying, okay, these companies are great, but they need to have a bigger, broader impact in the Chinese economy, and that the government is going to look at that and supervise it. So that, controlling the capitalist economy and make it more socialist may work out extremely well and lead to greater, economic distribution in China. It may also hobble the companies and lead to some reduced growth in the Chinese economy. And, economists are looking at this and arguing about it and so forth. China, the government of China is also making other moves. For example, it is banning the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, A, because it can control them, and B, also they use incredible amounts of energy. So on both of those scores, the Chinese are saying, we're not going to allow this. What impact this will have on the cryptocurrencies, that's not clear yet, but in any event, that's another Chinese move. Then what has been in the news is the incredible debt woes of this company, Evergrande, which is a property development company. They are in debt to the tune of $300 billion US, which is huge. And of course, they are, the bonds that they have issued and so forth are also outside of China. So this corporation, if it were to go down the rat hole, would, and the U.S. press has made much of this, become a kind of Lehman Brothers, right? A canary in the coal mine. And at the moment, the Chinese government doesn't seem to be bailing out this corporation. It has the capacity to do so. And what the people that I read, the economists that I read, generally speaking, think that when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, this Evergrande company will in some version be bailed out by the Chinese government, which has the capacity to do so. So you have all kinds of things going on. Corporations going to be looked at more closely. Corporations' indebtedness creating a problem. In generally speaking, China is saying we have a new economic direction that we want to go into, less sort of out of control capitalism, reintroducing more socialism, and so on. Now you can say, well, what does any of this have to do with international politics? Well, it has to do a lot with international politics because, of course, the economy and the growth of the Chinese economy has been a big factor in terms of the Chinese growth in the international system, its influence, its power capacity, its the fact that it's integrated into the global system. And what happens in China nowadays is not something obscure in some country that the rest of the world can forget about, but has major impact. Major impact in two ways. Major impact on spilling over into the global economy and the products that may be available and the investments of non-Chinese in those companies and so on. That's one thing. The second thing that it might have an impact on is that it really does, the Chinese government supervision really does begin to have a drag on the growth of the Chinese economy. That too will have an impact, not just domestically in China, but the role that China does play in the world, is able to play in the world, and the political implications both in China and outside of China. So all of this is going on while there are other totally different aspects of China in world affairs. One of them, of course, that will come to the fore in the next few weeks and months is the whole climate change situation. China is the largest polluter in the world. I think 28% or so of all the carbon pollution in the world comes from China. It's worth saying that per capita, we in the US do more polluting than per capita the Chinese do, but given the huge size of the Chinese population, it explains why they're such massive polluters. The Chinese economy is heavily dependent on coal and coal production. And no matter how bad using coal burning for energy sources, the Chinese know, and the rest of the world knows, they can't reverse course very, very quickly. So that is a problem and is a real problem for climate change. The Chinese are having two issues as we speak. One is that they are trying to be responsive to the sensibilities internationally about climate change and the role that China, A, plays in pollution and B, can do to help slow down climate change. And that is that they have announced that they will no longer build coal burning installations in the Belt and Road countries that they're so heavily invested in, but in all countries that they have relations with. So whether it's Latin America or South Africa or Asia, the Chinese have essentially said that the most immediate contribution they can make is not domestically for a variety of reasons, but they will make at least a commitment not to contribute outside of China to their various investments and building and technological help in producing coal burning energy plants in other countries. That, given the size of the problem in China, may seem a small thing, but it is a gesture of saying we recognize that climate change is a big international issue. It is a domestic issue in China, but it is also an international issue, obviously, a global issue that China is contributing to, and we can make this one adjustment very easily and very, very quickly. There is a domestic component right now to the coal issue, and that is that some northern provinces in China are now having energy shortages and are having, lights out, no heat, very serious cut offs of electricity and so forth. And that's due to the fact that there is a shortage of coal to keep the various coal plants working in China. So in these northern provinces, they just simply don't have enough coal to keep the energy sector going for the population. Uh, I have read somewhere, probably is true, that China is quickly trying to buy coal from Mongolia and so forth. But you can see that the growth of the Chinese economy also means that they need a lot of energy resources, a lot of electricity resources, and so forth. And even you having most of their energy come from coal, they don't even have enough at the moment to keep the whole enterprise going. So on the one hand, even internal to China, the coal is becoming an issue, and having to, move to alternative energy issues is not on the back burner, but is now on the front burner. And at the same time, China is trying to, buy friends and influencing people by saying, at least outside of China, we're going to try to be more responsible. Now, in fairness to China, it should be said, of course, that while on the one hand, China is this massive polluter, China is also the producer of the largest amount of the inputs to alternative energies. I mean, who produces most of the solar panels in the world? It's still China, right? So on the one hand, China technologically is making a global contribution to alternative energy sources, while at the same time domestically not being able to change as quickly as the world needs. Former Secretary of State Kerry was in China recently trying to talk about climate change, and he did not get a warm welcome. And that has as much to do with the inability of China to turn things around very quickly domestically, but it also has a lot to do with the fact that, America preaching to China right now is not extremely welcome, considering the China bashing and the other policies that are continuing in the U.S. government. What exactly role of China will be at the climate conference down the road in Glasgow is an open question. But I think it is very complex for the world, as well as very complex for China domestically, to cope with the whole energy issue, the pollution issue, and the dire global warming issue. And global warming will impact China just as it will impact other countries in terms of its domestic capacity for food growing and water and climate change and all the rest. So let me turn to something quite different, and that has to do with the recent announcement, otherwise known as AUKUS, where the U.S. has, or AUKUS more correctly, where the U.S. has announced that, along with England, that we will be supplying the Australians with a bunch of nuclear submarines. Now, this is a major issue. The submarines won't all be there for another, God knows, 15, 19 years and so forth. But it was a major American policy announcement, a policy announcement under the Biden administration. Can't blame Trump for that. And it has had very serious repercussions. One of the repercussions, of course, is our relations with Europe and France, which I think my next video will be about Europe in general and how this impacts Europe and France and our relations with our allies and so forth. But here I just want to mention how this links with China. China, of course, has been spreading its wings in the South China Sea, right? And has, sort of sent ships around and airplanes around and has claimed every rock and built little islands, and essentially says the South China Sea is in our backwater, a sort of Monroe Doctrine given out by China, right? This is our backyard and we will look at it. Well, that of course makes lots of people very uncomfortable. For example, Japan, for example, South Korea, for example, Taiwan, not to mention Southeast Asia, Philippines even. So this particular announcement is a kind of a throwing of the U.S. weight around on the one hand, saying, we're players in that part of the world as well. And we will look out for our allies, or at least our allies in that part of the world hope so. And at the same time saying to China, you can't have all of this territory. We're going to play a role. And also sort of lining up India and some Southeast Asian countries and saying, you need to group with us. There are subgroupings in that part of the world of the non-communist, non-China interests in this part of the world. We need to hold the line. So from a kind of America throwing its weight around, saying, okay, Australia is our ally there, and we're going to make sure that they can, protect themselves, but also can help protect the region, seems like a fairly sensible policy, except, of course, it is a massive confrontation of the U.S. essentially saying, we, without even consulting with our European allies, we're taking this step. Eat it. The Chinese had an interesting response to it. Rather than responding in kind somehow, they said, okay, well, if that's what you're going to do, US, we're going to join the current version of the TPP. You will recall the TPP is something that the Obama administration started in order to round up countries in economic relations and trade relations. It was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And while China was not barred from participating, it did not join in the beginning. And, we will these sort of having a network turning to Asia, which Obama administration announced. We're now going to turn more to Asia. This all seemed fairly sensible, except to the US Congress, which were not just Republicans, but also people, for example, on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, for example, Bernie Sanders and so forth, who were saying, this is going to give away too much American labor and all the rest of it. In any event, without going through all of that again, let's just say that we did not, in the end, we pulled out of the TPP. And then under Japanese and other guidances, some more Trans-Pacific Partnership was resurrected, slightly different initials, don't want to bore you with it, slightly different makeup. But anyway, the idea was to create a trading bloc in the Pacific. And that came about. And so that exists, right? And the US is not part of it. And China said, we're going to join it as a response to the nuclear deal with Australia, right? So China, rather than responding militarily and saying, now we're going to put, more planes and nuclear whatnots into the South China Sea, very cleverly said, okay, that's what you want to do. We're going to join this trading bloc, which you originally sort of set up, and which we're now going to join, and we're going to become part of the region and so forth. It needs to be said quickly that China actually joining might not happen. It will take a long time, and that has to do with them not being able to necessarily want to meet or able to meet the criteria of joining this particular club. But it was a kind of a diplomatic coup of sorts, saying, okay, you're going to put nuclear submarines out there. We in China will then become part of the trading arrangement in the Pacific. Very clever, actually. And while, as I said, it may not have a long-term consequence, at least it, showed China to be fast on its feet and trying to respond. Um, the drag for China internationally is, of course, still COVID, and at least the American assertion uh, by many that it was caused in the lab and that they were, they hid it for a while. They certainly did hid it for a while, and so forth. On the other hand, China has responded, and the way they've responded, other than denying the charges, has been to become a very major actor in international institutions. China, which used to play a very minimal role in the UN system, for example, now has Chinese heading various agencies or playing a major role in agencies in terms of funding them. China is very active, increasingly, especially most recently, in saying we can help the poor third world countries who have not had the vaccinations to vaccinate their people. So China has, on the one hand, done the same thing the US has done, saying, we need to look at our domestic circumstances and isolate ourselves a little bit. Ergo, it's, overseeing the private corporations in China. And on the other hand, is playing a very much more dominant role in the world in various ways, economic, health-wise, trade, every imaginable way. Now, bear in mind that China is the largest trading partner, the largest trading partner in the lives of about half the countries in the world, right? Including, some of our allies, whether it's the Germans selling them cars, whether it's Americans importing solar panels or whatever. China is deeply integrated, and the products that China produces are deeply integrated into the global economy. Even a little pullback here and there does not necessarily mean that it is in China's political interest to pull back and internalize and isolate so far that it no longer can play the economic role in the world that is required for the Chinese economy to continue to grow. So it's on the one hand, on the other. Many complex things are happening in the world in terms of the role that China is playing or can play. Some of it has to do with the failures of US policy, giving China openings to do so. Some of it has to do with the fact of the interdependence of so many countries and governments with China. Take the Germans for a moment. They are heavily dependent on trade with China. They sell cars and machinery and all kinds of things to China. And their industrial economy would suffer a lot if that all of a sudden stopped. On the other hand, the Germans criticize the treatment of the Uyghurs and human rights violations, and don't, approve of various aspects of Chinese policy. So it is perfectly possible to, as democratic Western countries, to take a stand against the human rights violations and the clamping down that is happening internal to China, while at the same time not be 100% China bashing and recognize that China, A, is a major power, will continue to be a major power, will probably overtake the US in the economy and every other aspect of world affairs sometime in the century, especially if we keep shooting ourselves in the foot. So one might as well deal with China. And when the Secretary General of the United Nations say, let's not have another Cold War, one of the things, of course, he has in mind is that at the height of the Cold War, you had one circumstance, but as the Cold War dragged on into the 70s and 80s, it is the case that all kinds of trade and technological exchanges that were non-military and so forth took place between the communist countries and the Western countries. So the plea really is, whenever possible, continue business more or less as usual. Don't hobble yourself in terms of not finding the voice to criticize violations of human rights and so on when they occur. But also remember that we have dealt and we continue to deal, we meaning the United States now, with all kinds of authoritarian governments in the world, and no one says a peep, right? Even European countries like Poland, for example, and Hungary, which are very authoritarian, we deal with them more or less as normal countries. And I think one of the pleas that international observers make, people like the Secretary General of the United Nations makes, is, for heaven's sake, don't blow up the world into another Cold War. Criticize when you must, but also recognize that things are complicated and you have, all kinds of relations that you need to carry on. One final point here is that at some point we need to talk about Biden administration's foreign policy, but suffice it to say that the kinds of noises we are making and the kind of overreaction we're having and the kind of China bashing we're having and the lack of sophistication very often about what is going on and not going on in China, and the kind of strange ways which we in the long term hurt ourselves. For example, over the years, thousands and thousands of Chinese students have come to study in the West, in the United States, and so forth. Of course, many of them have gone back to China and they're working for the government or Chinese corporations and so on. On the other hand, the linkages between those people, the Chinese scientists, American scientists, technologically competent people, is actually a good thing. It leads to a type of interdependence and comprehension. By barring Chinese to come to the United States to study, by not issuing them visas or discouraging them or creating situations that they don't come, we're actually hurting ourselves. So the problem, I think, with US-China policy, if I could just add, is a kind of one, overreaction, two, lack of sophistication and nuance. Now, I'm not saying China is not suffering from the same problem, but we're dealing here with the two dominant countries in the world right now, both of which have serious internal issues, serious external issues, and often are playing at the margin dangerous international games. And the recent US policy, this nuclear submarine, maybe nuclear submarines are necessary there, maybe not, we can debate this, but how it's done, when it's done, very often creates more chaos and more alienation than is good for any country, either the United States or China, or for that matter, the rest of the world. Thank you, and see you again in 2 weeks.